All right, thank you very much, Hannah. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Steve Bryan. I'm the chair of the All-Party Group on Childcare and Early Education. Welcome to our December meeting. I am on an iPhone, so if I look very small, it is not because I've shrunk, it's just the technology is where it is today. So thanks for coming. Should be an interesting discussion. Follows on from our previous session when we discussed our priorities for what we call an independent, meaningful review of early education policy and funding, which is our key ask of the government. I think what came very clearly out of that meeting was the practitioner-led discussion that we had around the challenges that the sector's workforce faces at the moment. We heard from a range of panelists then, and we'll hear from more today. There'll be time for Q&A after which Hannah will moderate for us. Our speakers who are on the line very welcome. I'll introduce in a minute. Please use the chat box function to feed through your questions or your intention to ask for them. Let me just say that, as ever, we are grateful to our sponsors who make the group possible. So that's CASH, the National Day Nurseries Association, the Early Years Alliance, Tops Day Nurseries and the Foundation Stage Forum. We're grateful to you for your ongoing support. Also, since we last met, we have had a very, very good debate in Parliament, which I put in for through the Backbench Business Committee, and I led that debate in conjunction with the all-party group on maintained nursery sector, and we had a debate titled "The Future of Nurseries and Early Education," which was responded to by Vicky Ford, the Minister at the Department for Education. And I've had lots and lots of really positive feedback from colleagues on all sides of the House about that debate and the way that it flushed out so many different issues. So we will be discussing as a group and officers of the group how we now follow that up. Clearly, it can't always be me that leads these debates because I'll only be lucky enough to get granted so many of them. So, you know, we need other members of Parliament, but there were some quite interesting speakers in that debate who weren't aware of as being passionate about this agenda, who I thought spoke really well. And the former Secretary of State, Damien Hines, was one of those, who's obviously my neighbour down in Hampshire. I've already spoken to Damien about that, so he's on notice. So today's meeting, which we'll have to finish within the hour, we'll be looking specifically at the early education workforce and unpacking all the issues that it faces every day in terms of pay, in terms of retention, recruitment and qualifications. Always at pains to stress, not least because I live with a stage 2 early years practitioner, this is a highly qualified workforce that is very often not recognised. We're very clear the ongoing funding crisis that the sector is having a significant impact on those that are employed within the sector, which is why we're calling for that independent, meaningful review of early education policy and funding. So today's session will hopefully help us to understand more about the specifics of that, how the government and the sector can, we think, work together to address the issues facing the workforce. We have got on the lineup today Josh Cottell, who is a senior researcher in education at the Education Policy Institute. Welcome, Josh. We've got Laura Barbour, early years lead at the Sutton Trust. Welcome, Laura. And Mary Ann Stephenson, who is from the UK Women's Budget Group, director of that organisation. Welcome to you, Mary Ann. So thanks so much for joining us. We're grateful for your time. I'm going to ask each of you to make some remarks for between 5 and 10 minutes. Less is always more here. Josh, from the EPI, you're very welcome. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me here today. So I'm just going to share my screen.
Great.
If you can see that. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to be talking through some of the trends that on the pressures the early years workforce has faced in recent years, and some of the emerging evidence we've got about the pressures it's faced since the pandemic began. So to begin with, why care about the early years workforce specifically as a part of the early years? Well, I shouldn't have to convince too many of you in the audience today that a high quality workforce, that's a workforce that's well educated, highly motivated, with good access to CPD opportunities and so on, is key to the quality of early education for young children. But despite its importance, the workforce has faced a series of challenges which have persisted over time. These include low income, high workload and responsibilities, low status and reputation, a lack of diversity, and that's both in terms of gender, with 98% of the workforce being female, and in terms of ethnicity, with recent data suggesting that the workforce is not fully representative of the population, and insufficient training and career opportunities. And so I'm just going to focus in on low income, which is one of the pressures here, and show how that's changed over the last decade or so. So what we've got here is a graph showing the pay of different sectors of the workforce over the last decade or so. The top line, the pink line, is teachers in both primary and secondary schools. Then the middle line, the grey line, is the female workforce as a whole. Childcare workers are the light green line, and the dark green line is workers in competing occupations at the bottom. And what we can see here is that between 2008 and 2010, early years workers earned on average significantly less than the average for the female workforce, but a little bit more than those in competing occupations, and that's beauticians and hairdressers. But then fast forwarding to 2013 to 18, early years workers saw a fall in their real terms pay of just under 5%. And in the meantime, workers in beauty and hairdressing saw their pay rise. So there's been a convergence there, putting additional strain on the workforce as an attractive sector. So in 2018, early years workers on average earned about £8.20 an hour, and that's about 40% less than the female workforce as a whole, and it's substantially less than it is for teaching workers. We also know,
Josh, can you just make sure that you speak up just a little bit, and whoever is in the shower, lovely for you, but if you could just mute yourself while you're in the shower, then we wouldn't hear the water. That would be great. Thanks. Carry on, Josh.
Sure. Do interrupt me if it's quiet again. I'll try holding my microphone a bit closer.
And that is the division bell here, but I'm not voting, so carry on.
So we also know that in 2018, just under half of early years workers were accessing state benefits, and that's a significantly higher proportion than we saw for female workers as a whole. So overall, what we're seeing is quite a lot of financial pressures on early years workers, and this is a problem that hasn't gone away and has in fact gotten slightly worse over the last decade or so. So now looking at the pressures since the pandemic, so there have been a lot of pressures on early years providers, mainly stemming from reduced demand, both for paid for and government funded places. And so at the height of the pandemic, we saw the number of children attending early years providers down to about 5% of what we would have expected in the absence of a pandemic. It's up to about 85% now, but crucially still less than we saw before the pandemic. Meanwhile, we've seen higher costs due to social distancing measures and abiding by guidelines to try and control the virus. And we've seen settings have to make a load of staffing decisions. So which staff to place on the furlough scheme, which staff to have their hours reduced, and which staff to make redundant. And staff have also left voluntarily different settings and the sector altogether. The support that's been provided for the sector by the government, there's been a considerable amount of support. This has come through many different streams. A couple of the key ones are continued funding for government-funded early education and childcare, which has been relatively generous in the autumn term, but is due to change from January, and we should be hearing more about that perhaps later this week. The coronavirus job retention scheme, or the furlough scheme, which paid up to 80% of staff salaries, was another key one. And so I'm going to talk about that furlough scheme in just a moment as part of some research that we've done in collaboration with the National Day Nurseries Association. We did a survey of early years providers in England, Scotland and Wales in August of this year, and it's the first of 4 surveys that we're going to be doing over the course of a year. We had 400 responses representing about 450 providers, and we asked those settings about the staff that they'd employed in March of this year and what decisions they'd taken about those staff in the intervening period. What we found is that just over 70% of early years staff had been furloughed between March and August of this year. And interestingly, that those with lower levels of qualifications were more likely to be placed on furlough. We also asked staff about the redundancies that they'd made and found that 4% of staff had been made redundant between March and August, and that again, those staff with lower levels of qualification were the most likely to have been affected by this. And we saw a similar pattern for those staff that had voluntarily left. And so what insights can we glean from these findings? Well, some of you in the audience might be kind of On the one hand, slightly relieved that those that settings have tried to hold on to those staff with the most experience, the most qualifications. But we might also be concerned that those staff might represent the future of the sector, those who are looking to upskill within the sector, have been the most likely to be affected by redundancy and by furlough. And remember, when I said that about the average pay in the sector is about £8.20 an hour, that's lower for some early years workers, and that's most likely to be lower for those with the lowest levels of qualifications. So the furlough scheme pays up to 80% of staff salaries. So that means if those with lower qualifications are most likely to be furloughed, they're most likely to both already be on a lower salary and to then receive less income when they were furloughed. So there's quite a lot of pressure on the sector, and it's had this kind of this effect more on those with lower levels of qualification. So finally, just to sum up, some things we might keep an eye out for over the coming months are the nature of continued funding for further education, further funded entitlements, which we're likely to hear about later this week, as I said. The demand for places, not just whether that returns to pre-pandemic levels, but how quickly. The distributional impacts that I've just been talking about on the shape of the workforce. And then to safeguard the workforce, support from the government should include a range of things. I'm just going to highlight some of them here. In the short term, support for otherwise viable businesses, which will ensure the supply of government funded and paid for places, and training opportunities, which means that those providers that have downsized in recent months, have seen staff leave, are able to quickly scale up their operation if demand increases rapidly. And in the longer term, I think we want to see funding that reflects the cost of providing high quality childcare, a coordinated policy response, and a conversation at society level about the importance of early child development to safeguard the status of early years workers as a career. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening.
Steve, you're on mute at the moment.
Thanks very much, Josh. Sorry for the different interruptions. I did try to mute here, so you didn't hear the division bell, but that's very good, very interesting, and thank you for sharing screen so well. Now, Mary-Ann Stephenson, who is director from the UK Women's Budget Group, is online. Mary, welcome. You have the floor.
Hello. Yes. Thank you very much for inviting me. So I'm going to focus many of the things similar to what was covered in the previous session about the situation of the childcare workforce pre-COVID. So as was said, this is almost entirely female workforce, 98% women, low paid, an average wage of £9.64 an hour. Childminders in particular are often low paid, and I think childminders are often not part of discussions about childcare. A lot focuses on nurseries.
Agreed.
70% of childminders have earnings at or below the national living wage. 40% of childcare workers reliant on universal credit or tax credits to make ends meet. And as we know, high levels of staff turnover, nearly a quarter of staff turnover in 2019, of which nearly half left to work in retail, which I think links with the previous presentation, showing the closing of the gap between childcare and other sorts of work that Josh was talking about. We also saw a fall in the number of nursery workers qualified to level 3, so a fall from 83% in 2015-16 to 52% in 2019. An increase in a portion of the workforce made up of unqualified assistants, trainees or apprentices, up from 16%. And employers planning to cut spending on training, again, the majority because of concerns about underfunding. And this is a pre-COVID situation. Obviously, it won't be a surprise to most of you here that underfunding is a significant problem within childcare, particularly the gap between the funding provided for the free childcare places and the actual cost of providing those places. Which is significant for 2-year-olds and fairly substantial for 3 to 4-year-olds, which in turn, as we know, leads to higher costs for paid for hours, thus increasing the cost of childcare for parents. If we move on to thinking about what happened during COVID, obviously during the first lockdown, We had low occupancy rates because it was only children of key workers who were able to access childcare and at-risk children. But even after lockdown, in the first few weeks of the summer, that went up to less than 40% occupancy, with a third of nurseries reporting levels of less than 25% occupancy. And in October, average occupancy rates were about 60% of the usual level for this time of year, and significantly lower for childminders, down 44%. So as we know, a majority of childcare providers anticipate running at a loss for the rest of the year, and a quarter believe that they'll close within a year, particularly nurseries in poorer areas. And again, this is part of a pattern that predates COVID, that because of the underfunding of the sector and because of the reliance on the private hours paid for by parents, childcare providers find it very difficult to survive in poorer areas where there aren't parents who can afford to pay that gap. So we have a significant under provision of childcare in the poorest parts of this country, and this looks set to get worse. And that in turn has an impact on women. So if you look at the research that was done by Pregnant Then Screwed, they showed that 46% of mothers who'd been made redundant during the pandemic has said that a lack of childcare was a factor in the selection for redundancy. 72% of mothers said they'd worked fewer hours and cut their earnings due to a lack of childcare, and a third had lost a childcare place since March. And again, what we've seen, we did a webinar earlier this week, actually looking at women's paid and unpaid work, and there was research from the Centre for Life Course Studies at UCL and also from academics at Nottingham and Warwick universities, and they were both reporting a combination of mothers asking to be furloughed because of childcare problems, and also mothers feeling that they were more likely to be selected for furlough because of childcare problems, because their employers felt that if they were at home with small children, they would be less likely to be able to get on with their work. And this seems to be the case from IFS research, which showed that mothers had far less uninterrupted work time during the first lockdown than fathers, that even when both parents were at home with the children, it was more likely to be mothers whose working day was interrupted, let alone periods when they couldn't work at all. So we did a briefing with the New Economics Foundation, which I will share in the chat after this. And we're supporting their recommendations in the short term for urgent intervention, and for the establishment of a childcare infrastructure fund, that actually the free hours and furlough payments have created problems for childcare providers, because it's very difficult to distinguish which staff are covered by free hours to see whether or not they're entitled to furlough. So NEF are calling for all of that funding to be replaced and enhanced with a childcare infrastructure fund, which would provide larger payments directly to providers in order to provide free childcare to all children, prioritising vulnerable children and children of key workers, to not charge fees to parents whose children aren't currently using childcare, to not make staff redundant and pay every worker at a rate equal to the real living wage, and also to have the requirement to provide clarity on tax status and not pay dividends or share paybacks during the period while they're in receipt of support through that scheme. And that's a short-term urgent intervention. In the longer term, the Women's Budget Group has been calling for a system of free universal childcare. And again, I'll post the link to the work that we've done modelling that in the chat afterwards. But one of the pieces of work we did for our Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, which published in September, was looking at investment in the care sector as a whole. So this is looking not only at childcare, but also at adult social care. And that's the last slide I wanted to show, calling for a care-led recovery and comparing the jobs that would be created by investment in care compared to investment in construction, responding to the government's focus on build, build, build. As you can see, we modelled two options, one 1.9% of GDP and one 2.7% of GDP. Both create significantly more jobs if you invest that money in care than in construction. About the same number of jobs for men and very many more jobs for women. So this would be a way to meet the needs of children, to meet the needs of working parents, and also to ensure that childcare workers were paid and trained properly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Thank you very much indeed. And then finally, we have Laura Barbour with us, Early Years Lead from the Sutton Trust. Laura, you have the floor.
Thank you. Although I can't quite, don't think I can quite see you all. Let me just, if I can't quite see you all, I am very aware that much of what I'm going to discuss today will probably be really very familiar. And I want to kind of recognise that the most reliable and authentic voice comes from those of you who are on the front line of delivery. But I do hope that the work of the Sutton Trust is able to support and really emphasise the points that you make and the details that you know so well. And that we can make the case that this isn't just an issue about sector sustainability, it's really one for society as a whole, and particularly, of course, the life chances of the most vulnerable. So we know that there's overwhelming evidence that the first 5 years is critical and formative and should at the very least be on an equal footing with the current formal period of education. But I just want to say, I do think that there's a real risk that for those of us who either work in direct delivery or spend time in research, we can find ourselves in an echo chamber. And I think the Royal Foundation report, which was published a couple of weeks ago now, I think, it was a salutary reminder when in the survey of, I think it was over 400,000, basically quite self-selecting people, more than 75% didn't recognise the specific importance of the 0 to 5 period for providing lifelong health and happiness. And I think if collectively we are to have the kind of real influence on policy, we've got to do more about getting the messages out beyond our bubble. The Sutton Trust has published 3 reports this year, which all have, I hope, relevance to the vital role played by the early years workforce. And I'm going to be referencing the work of Nathan Archer, Beatrice Merrick, who helped us with Getting the Balance Right, and Chris Pascal and Tony Bertram from CREC, who co-authored the Sutton Trust briefing on the impact of COVID-19 on the early years, but also the workforce review, which we produced in partnership with the Early Years Workforce Commission. And so recently, I think it was Vicky Ford highlighted that pre-COVID figures had shown an overall improvement in the percentage of children reaching a good level of development, which of course is positive news. But despite this the aspirational statements on closing the school readiness gap between disadvantaged children and their peers, as we know, efforts to close this gap in outcomes for children aged 5 have stalled, and the gap is widening again. And it slowly decreased from 7 to 17, and then by 19 it was back to levels at 2015. And obviously, again, this was pre-COVID, and with recent absences from settings or children not starting in settings, the numbers going down, as Josh has already referred to, the likelihood is this gap is going to widen. So it's never been more important to prioritise this sector. As you well know, COVID-19 has highlighted the role of the early years settings, and of course, providers have come to be known as the essential, as the fourth emergency service, and it was a well-deserved title. But once again, we kind of go back to the importance that it's really it's about the priority of the settings is supporting children's well-being and development, and really learning at a vital time in their lives. I think with that, there's got to be an emphasis on equality of opportunities for access for young children from all backgrounds, so as not to create additional challenges for social mobility. And I have to say again, that the 30-hour extended offer is obviously not currently a universal offer, but only open to those children with parents working a minimum number of hours. And it was the recent EPI report which identified a positive association for children who attended setting with a graduate, I think it was for more than 15 hours, and that included the most disadvantaged. So in the very first instance, we would kind of be recommending that eligibility for 30 hours offer should be extended to all families of 3 and 4-year-olds who are currently eligible for the 2-year-old offer. And that would include those who are out of work or on very low incomes. And this would, of course, provide better continuity for families with children aged 2 to 4, but also refocus funding on closing the school readiness gap. Of course, we do completely recognise that this extension would have to be matched with an increase to the hourly funded rate. And perhaps this could be funded by reducing eligibility for houses at the households at the higher income levels. So again, going over points that are very familiar to you, access is essential, but is also now well documented that the key is not to compromise on quality. And reports from the Nutt-Brown review to the Mathers Sutton Trust report, Sound Foundations, have established that a professionalised, well-qualified and adequately rewarded workforce is crucial to securing the high quality of provision required for positive impact on educational and social outcomes, and particularly for the less advantaged. The excellent Epi Nuffield report by Sarah Bonetti and Joe Blandon, which I've already mentioned, it provided further valuable evidence of this, and in particular highlighting the positive impact on learning outcomes of the presence of early years workers qualified as either QTS or early years teacher status. And the fact that that impact was seen both at the age of 5, but also until at least the age of 11. So again, there needs to be a clear vision for the early years and childcare workforce and a restatement of the crucial importance of achieving a well-qualified, high status and better rewarded profession in line with the rest of education provision. You know, the 2017 early years workforce strategy failed to put in place a long-term plan, and a key commitment to grow the graduate workforce in disadvantaged areas was dropped. I know from all the information we get from the sector, you're facing a crisis in recruitment and retention, with more qualified and experienced staff often leaving the sector due to poor salaries and conditions. And there is widespread concern about the viability of the sector, let alone raising standards, as rising costs have just not been met by rises in government funding rates, leading to closures and many in disadvantaged areas. And this was before the challenges of COVID. And of course, additional funds have recently been allocated, but as I understand from the sector's reaction, it's clear that this has just not been at sufficient levels to meet the existing funding deficit. And we've called on research by the National Day Nursery Association, which has shown a decline in the proportion of staff qualified to level 3 or with graduate qualifications. And we know that recruitment remains a challenge. And the aspiration to make level 3 a benchmark qualification for the sector should be revived, and incentives to achieve it should be offered. Of course, the government announcement at the beginning of December that there will be fully funded courses available from April 21, which will include early years and childcare level 3 qualifications, was heartily welcomed by the sector. But there still needs to be a long-term aspiration to have a qualified teacher in every setting. And to do this, government should address the recruitment of perhaps early years teachers and their parity with teachers holding QTS. And perhaps by introducing a route for QTS early years, including access to the early career framework, or bolstering conversion courses available for those already qualified as early years teachers who wish to gain QTS, along with taking steps towards parity of pay and conditions for qualified teachers working in the non-maintained sector. One proven way, I think it was Epi research on top of the original NatSen research, so it showed that a short-term solution could be for beginning to address this is through what we're calling a leadership quality fund, which can be accessed by settings in order to attract, hire and adequately pay qualified staff or train existing staff. This incentive for graduate leaders to be employed in all early years settings, should be reinstated, but especially for those working with the less advantaged children and those with particular needs. Again, of course, continuing professional development, which follows on from initial training, needs to be a requirement for all staff throughout their careers and properly funded, with the current barriers to access addressed. Perhaps again, an immediate targeted solution for funding could be an increase in the early years pupil premium, so that it's at least in line with a pupil premium in primary years, with consideration given to the rate, eligibility criteria and minimising barriers to accessing the funding, including the frequency of eligibility changes, so basically making it equivalent to the EVER FSM, which happens in the primary years. The Sutton Trust has calculated that to raise the early years pupil premium to be in line with the hourly primary school rate, it would cost about an additional 35 million a year. And then, of course, there's the maintained nursery schools, and we know that they make up a small proportion of the sector, but are beacons of high quality and hubs for ideas and training. And they're often located to cater disproportionately to the less advantaged. To recognise this contribution and, of course, provide stability, their funding should be set at a sustainable level and put on a long-term basis. As we move into a hopefully post-COVID world, we need to continue to focus on social mobility as a gap in educational outcomes for less advantaged children is widening, and really to focus on ensuring fair access and the development of a quality early years workforce. There are key challenges in achieving this ambitious agenda, which are sharpened in the current context of a post-pandemic and post-Brexit world. The costs of establishing and sustaining a highly qualified early years workforce are significant, but really should be seen as an investment in human capital for future generations and a signal of the importance given to securing social mobility for left behind young children. This is a sector which has the potential to attract some of the most passionate, skillful and committed workers. But we need to change government and public perceptions of a sector which to date has been viewed as perhaps providing primarily a childcare function to a sector which is seen as highly professionalised and vital foundational element of our educational system with the capability and capacity to drive much needed social and economic renewal. I think there's never been a time when the case for investment in this vital sector has been more strong. And there are 4 actions that we could put in place immediately. Introducing the Leadership Quality Fund, achieving parity between the early years pupil premium and pupil premium in the primary school years, extending the 30-hour offer in the first instance those eligible for the 2-year-old, but also increasing their hourly funded rate at the same time, and to set funding for maintained nurseries at a sustainable level and put on a long-term basis. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Laura. Very clear. Just to say to everybody that you can tweet about this. It's the APPG Early Years is our Twitter account, and on there you will see linked from that the debate that I referred to that we had in Westminster Hall a few weeks ago. If you're not luckily enough on Twitter, then you can find it via my website, which is all uploaded on there, which is stevebrine.com. Anyway, so just before we hand over to Hannah to moderate questions, just a question that I might wish to throw in using chair's privilege. Laura, maybe you want to give a thought on this. What would be your thought, and what indeed research points to around changing ratios within early years? What would be the impact of changing ratios, bearing in mind that, we're not living in a world where there is plentiful growing budgets in every single area, and it is very, very hard to make this case within government. What if the ratios were to change?
I think particularly with the ratios, and Panima and Neil and people that will be better placed to talk about it from a practical point of view. But I think what we always think is this: it's not a one size fits all, and there's got to be some kind of logic put in. So sometimes, for example, if you're talking in the context of a childminder, there is kind of just good sense about, what is practical. If you're in a primary school situation, there's sometimes more flexibility because you've got other teachers to call on. So I think it slightly depends on the situation. But I think also, it's very important with something like the kind of, particularly with the 2-year-old offer, that, it's not just about ratios, it's about the environment that the children are in. So, you could be in a huge room, you could have the right ratios, but you're not providing the appropriate environment. So I think it has ratios, perhaps sometimes it's something it has to be seen in a kind of practical context.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Anyway, thinking out loud. Hannah, who do we have?
So I had a question just sort of in relation to the policy context, I suppose, and was wondering if any of the panelists have an idea about how the plan for jobs might be sort of adapted to better support the early education workforce. If there are any sort of opportunities within that you've noticed. anyone just wants to jump in, feel free.
Could I ask you to repeat the question, Hannah? Sorry, I didn't quite get that.
Absolutely. So how do you think, if there's a way, the plan for jobs might be better adapted to support the early years workforce?
I'm not sure exactly about how the plan for jobs can be adapted to help the early years workforce, but I think when it comes to helping the early years workforce, we need investment on at least two sides. One is subsidizing the cost of the qualifications that are available and making sure that those qualifications are providing the right kinds of things. And so some work that EPI released last week found that there were over 300 different early years qualifications at degree level that people could access via the UCAS system. And this, there's quite a lot of variation between these different qualifications, and it might be that not all of them are best suited for early years practitioners. So we need subsidy for those qualifications to make sure that those qualifications are the right kinds of things. And we also need funding so that providers can pay staff members at competitive rates, so that you can ensure that early years workers are incentivized not only to stay within, but also to upskill within the workforce.
I think that's an important point. I also think that more broadly, you know, one of the ways of making the case for better funding for the childcare sector is actually as a form of social infrastructure, which is fundamental if other people are going to be able to get into employment. You know, that it's not just about thinking about jobs for childcare workers in terms of plans for jobs within that sector. It's actually about thinking about the sector as a whole as a fundamental form of infrastructure, without which it's going to be very difficult for large numbers, particularly women, to get back into the labour market.
Yeah, thank you. Right, Hannah, who do we have from the punters, as it were, or the sponsors who wish to ask questions?
So one of the
comments.
One of the themes we've got going on in the chat conversation is about if everybody is paid a national living wage, how you differentiate people who are have higher qualifications or might be a deputy manager or graduates. And that was a question that came from Cheryl. And Cheryl also pointed out that, you know, people at those kinds of levels within the organisation should ideally be on salaries closer to teachers or nurses sort of level of wage. Wondering if
I think the funding that's necessary is not to pay everyone the real living wage, but to have the real living wage as a baseline, which is the lowest level at which people could be paid. And obviously you then need to have more qualified people or people with more management responsibilities being paid more. And that does require funding. I mean, I think the problem is at the moment, it's not possible within the current funding framework to do that. So this is a case of recognizing that we need to invest in the early years workforce, because as Laura was saying, it's vital for the well-being of children and for closing the attainment gap between poorer children and better children from better off families.
I think there's also the issue. I mean, we were talking about the differences, perhaps why you might lose someone who has a graduate status from the PVI sector might move into the maintained precisely because of the work conditions, but also the kind of pay structure and the career opportunities. And that's something that we would like to see parity across the sectors.
Yeah, so sort of following on from that theme, Jonathan from NDNA had a question about, he said, so we know the impact of a higher quality or more qualified staff lasts with children throughout their primary education and beyond. So with that in mind, how might we start to get school leaders to advocate for the importance of investing in early years?
Well, I think one of the things is when you talk about school leaders investing, I was very interested when I went to visit Feltham, the Reach Academy there, and I think, you know, they have children coming in from, you know, they started at kind of primary level, and now they go back to, then they went back to the early years, and they have children coming in from 2, and in fact they were so convinced about the importance of starting early that they've now also funded a kind of a family hub that kind of supports the families from 0 to 2. So I think sometimes it's when you actually, school leaders see the value of supporting children from the very earlier stages, that's when it's kind of the most powerful.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the evidence is there. I think the problem is that childcare is still often seen as a sort of very niche issue that's about enabling women to get into the labour market, and it's very significant in enabling women to get into the labour market. But the benefits of childcare for children, although they're well known within the sector, are not as widely talked about more generally when people talk about childcare. It's not part of the general childcare conversation, and we have the similar problem with childcare that I think we do actually with adult social care, which is that often the starting point is about how do we keep the costs down, and rather than how do we actually fund a system that does what we want it to do, which is to provide high quality childcare for all children, and that should be our starting point, and then recognising that that requires a significant level of investment, but that our modelling showed, the modelling we looked at, which was free universal childcare from the end of a maternity leave period, showed that the vast majority of that investment would be recouped through savings in social security and gains in tax payments. There is a requirement for ongoing investment. It doesn't entirely pay for itself, but it largely pays for itself.
I just wanted to come in, if I could, on that childcare versus education debate, which I think Marianne is so right to point out. And I think it's something that's some pressure has been put on since the pandemic, as people have talked about it a lot more in terms of childcare, I think, in terms of getting people back to work, as is important, and less about the education and the development of young children. I think when it comes to advocating on behalf of it and seeing how important it is that we have a well-qualified, high-quality workforce, it's also important to recognise that it's quite a nuanced picture. There are lots of things that feed into this. So the report that came out last week from EPI that Laura was talking about found an association between graduates in early years settings and children's outcomes later on. But it found that this was a stronger association for those children who've been attending for more than 15 hours. And so there's lots of different parts of this puzzle that need to be in place so that children can attend earlier settings and benefit from it in the way that school leaders want them to.
Thank you all. So I think another theme that we've sort of touched on a little bit already, but I was wondering if we were able to go into a little more detail on, is about the way that qualifications are funded and that people are supported to undertake early years qualifications at the moment. I was wondering if any of you had any specific thoughts on how that could be improved.
I think the funding from DFE, sorry if I may, just the funding from DFE that was announced, I think last September, about providing funding for people to take on qualifications and also paying settings for the time lost from those staff taking on training was really good. I think it's at a relatively small scale at the moment, but if there's evidence that it's working, then I think that there's a really good case to be made that that ought to be scaled up to allow more people to benefit from it.
I mean, again, I referenced it when I was talking about it, but often one talks about things and we don't have evidence for their positive impact. And the Graduate Leader Fund, which we've kind of reframed as the Leadership Quality Fund, there's really kind of hard evidence, as I say, both from the EPI report from January of this year, but also back from, I think it was 2011, from the NatSen work carried out by the Oxford team, which identified that pot of funding really had a kind of made a tangible difference to supporting, you know, the qualifications of workforce when it was available. And we were suggesting that it should initially, you know, be targeted on the areas most in need. But, you know, ideally you would have that available across the board.
Yeah, so our research, the report that Laura is referring to by my colleagues, looked at a range of different policies in the early years over the past decade and found that the Graduate Leader Fund was the one that stood out as having had a positive impact on the qualifications of the sector. So between 2007 and 2011, when funding for the Graduate Leader Fund was ring-fenced, the number of early years workers with a bachelor's degree or the equivalent increased by more than 3/4 over that period. Once the funding was not ring-fenced anymore, then it became significantly less effective. But we can learn the lessons from that funding stream that was almost a decade ago now in new policies which seek to improve the workforce.
Well, thank you.
you.
Sorry, Steve, were you going to come
No,
on?
carry on.
We had another question, which is from Nathan Archer, and this is on the issue of underspends, which is something that we've done a bit of work on in the past as well, and NDNA, who are one of our sponsors, has done a lot of work on, and we've sort of brought that to the attention of the Chancellor. And so Nathan's question was, given that there's been £1.7 billion in unspent tax-free childcare, how can the sector lobby for this investment to be made in the infrastructure and workforce and not lost? Do any of the panelists have any additional thoughts on that question?
I mean, I think more generally, actually, we would say that the tax-free childcare scheme is not an effective way of targeting support for the childcare sector, that it is much more effective to target the supply side rather than the demand side of childcare and actually pay money directly to childcare providers. And that it's, you know, when we know that it's children from the poorest families who gain the most from childcare, and we know that childcare in the poorest areas is often the hardest to find and the most overstretched and the hardest for providers to provide training for their staff because they don't have additional money coming in from private funders at the same level to cross-subsidise. They can't charge the same rates. Actually, the tax-free childcare scheme doesn't seem like the best way to target investment. So I don't know how you make the argument that if that money is underspent, it should be spent on something else. I mean, I think the main argument is to say, look, this is the gap. This is the gap in funding that the childcare sector was facing prior to the pandemic, and it is only getting worse. And as I said before, this is a vital form of infrastructure. It has benefits beyond just the families who access childcare. It benefits the whole of society. You know, if I need to go to see my GP, I am reliant on the fact that she's able to access childcare for her twins, because otherwise she wouldn't be there to be able to give me the treatment that I need. So it's as fundamental as roads or rail for the well-being of the economy, and we need to see it at that level and invest in it accordingly.
I think that's absolutely, you know, just supporting what you said, Marianne, but also again, you know, back on making the point that it's fundamental to kind of keep society running, but it's also fundamental for the children's education. You know, it probably starts, you know, we want to start at birth and see it as it's the journey. It doesn't start, you know, education, as we know, doesn't start at 5. You know, no one questions children going to school at 4, and no one calls school childcare. You know, it's education, and I think, you know, we also need to see it in those terms. You know.
And we need to think about that model when we're thinking about funding. Yeah. You know, we don't try and fund education through giving parents kind of free hours that they can use and tax breaks and other things. We actually recognise that if you want to have a proper education system, you need to fund it properly.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if any of you have any thoughts on what the impact of the recently announced lifetime skills guarantee might have on qualifications within the sector's workforce. Because, you know, if this new policy where more people are able to access financial support to, you know, take out loans to undertake these qualifications. If you think
the problem is, if you have a workforce that is badly paid, then the enabling people to take out loans, which would increase their qualifications, but won't actually necessarily increase their pay rates by a huge amount, is quite a difficult argument to make. I think if you want to improve the qualifications of the childcare sector, there needs to be more direct support provided rather than loans. I mean, there are sectors where loans make sense because people can get training and get much better paid jobs, and that's, you know, that's an investment in their future. But unfortunately, the way the childcare sector is currently structured, I don't think it's reasonable to expect somebody on a low wage to take out a loan in order to be on a slightly less low wage.
That's such a key point about, yeah, reforming the qualifications won't necessarily improve anything until ultimately the issue is the funding crisis itself. And I think that that's the message that consistently comes through in every meeting that we have, and it's the message that we're continually pushing and that Steve's been pushing so hard in Parliament as well. Steve, I don't know whether there were any comments that you wanted to add to the discussion.
No, it's fascinating. I'm learning as much as leading as should be the case. That's what I'm a parliamentarian too. So no, anyone else who wishes to chip in, please do so. Otherwise, we'll draw things to a close.
I know that we've just got a couple of parliamentarians with us on the call as well. So if any of you wanted to raise any points as well, please do come forward. We've had such an interesting discussion in the chat, and thank you to everyone contributing. One question that's been raised is how might we engage the Education Secretary further, where, you know, his priorities are often on other parts of the sector. What do we think we can do to kind of sort of drive home the importance of this sector and the investment that's needed?
I think that is for us as officers of the group to discuss how best it is to engage our colleagues and, you know, make use of the expertise that we have on the back benches, who obviously have knowledge as to how to reach the front benches, and many of us have been there, so we're in a good place to do that. The other way, you know, as I said at the start, we had one very good debate, and there was actually another debate here today on the wider early years first 1,001 days agenda, which Andrea Ledson led, which while is not about nurseries and early years settings, is clearly critical in terms of viewing early years education. As Laura rightly said, it must be seen. So, yeah, we need more parliamentary moments. Nothing ever changes here through one thing. When you're a minister, you know, if you get parliamentary questions, you then get a debate. It then comes up in oral questions. That is how you notice an unstoppable force for change. No one thing in isolation moves mountains here. It's about persistence and multi-channel approach. I'm sure my parliamentary colleagues would agree.
Steve, forgive me if I sound like I'm interrupting. It's David Simmons.
Hello, David. You were one of the excellent speakers that I was referring to at the start, who you know, I wasn't aware of your interest in this sector, but you spoke very well, and we were very grateful for you taking part in the debate. Yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. It was a very useful discussion. We'll just be interested in hearing people's reflections on the effectiveness of schools forums as a means for distributing early years funding, because the way that those budgets are allocated locally is decided by those bodies, which are supposed to be representative of all the local early years, primary, secondary and college sectors. And, you know, all around the country, we tend to see quite big underspends building up in the early years element of the dedicated schools grant, because it is ring-fenced, which means that a local authority has no freedom to direct some of those resources in ways that the sector might wish. It can only be determined through that formula and through the schools forum. And often the feedback, certainly I've had, has been that early years representatives feel that their voices are drowned out really by particularly big secondary schools who tend to dominate the discussion. So I'm just interested in, for those who may have either been themselves a representative or been part of that discussion, whether you think that is an effective method, and if it isn't, what you think would be a better way of distributing that money that's more effective for the early years sector.
It's such a great question, David. We have talked before in the group about the way that academy schools, for instance, are funded much more directly, and when you have a situation where different upper tier authorities keep different amounts back for all sorts of reasons we've heard as to why money is kept back. And I talked about it, if you remember, in my opening remarks in the debate. I'd be very interested to know if any of our speakers have a view on the excellent point David's just put there around school forums.
Sorry, I don't know anything about enough about school forums to comment.
Okay.
Afraid I'm in the same position.
Me too.
All right, no, that is why it's a good point. We clearly need to do some more work on this, and I would suggest that it would be a very, very useful conversation, Hannah, for one of our next meetings, one of our next guests, to see who could talk to us about that. David, I'll pick this up with you offline.
Yeah, thank you for raising that point. We definitely made a note of it, and it's something that we can take forward. So one final question that we've just had come up in the chat, which is actually something that, Steve, I know that you've talked about before as well, is the possibility of making academy-style funding available for the early years. And just, yeah. We've got a couple of moments left, but I wonder if any of you on the panel had any thoughts on that. I can see you shaking your heads. Steve, did you want to just sort of give a bit of background onto your sort of thinking behind that one?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, academy schools are funded very differently to maintained schools. And, we are looking at ways of being more efficient in the way that we fund early years. We're looking at the way of dealing with underspends. We're looking at dealing with various upper tier authorities keeping back their wildly different amounts, and I just wonder whether that is a stone that we should look at. It's something that if you remember, we planted as a seed with the Chancellor when we met him in the summer, and he seemed very interested in that. I appreciate what Aurora said about needing a bigger cake for the sector, bigger size cake, which is true, but equally, in the economic context that we sit, we also have to remember that chancellors are very interested in hearing about much more efficient ways of getting money to the front line of services, and I'm not sure we are efficient in getting money to the front line of services.
Steve, perhaps just to add to that, the reason why I think this is a useful discussion to get into in the context of schools forums is that whether a school is an academy school or a maintained school, the funding rate is determined by the schools forum locally. So the cake that is the dedicated schools grant is divided up. And of course, then the difference is that the money is paid into the school's bank account directly by the Education and Skills Funding Agency if it's an academy, or it's paid through the local authority in the event that it is a maintained school. So it doesn't have a significant effect on the per child rate that's received. That just reflects the division of the cake. But what we do see is that schools forums often are asked to do things like, in respect of early years, to allocate resources to build capacity, to pump prime new openings, because children don't all arrive in one go at the start of term in the way they do for schools, but they often are recruited throughout the year. And often we've seen that the decisions of schools forums have been to refuse to do that, because it tends to be schools that are used to a particular pattern that are making those decisions. And therefore early years providers who are either trying to enter the market or who are trying to develop additional capacity find that more of a challenge. And especially in areas like SEND, it's enormously frustrating, having been in a local authority as the lead member for children's services to develop a plan with the early years sector about developing capacity, to then have the early years representatives go to the schools forum and say, this is what we want to do with our share of the budget, to then be told by the schools forum, no, we're not willing to fund it. All we're willing to do is to agree an hourly funding rate for you, and then when you reach those numbers, you will get it paid to you per capita. So I think to me, rooting a lot more of the funding in a dynamic discussion between the local authority and the early years sector, rather than through the schools forum, would be more productive in achieving that. But also it may be that there are places in the country where the early years voice is really being effective and making a difference at schools forums. And ultimately, it feels to me, if we go and challenge the Chancellor, we go and challenge the DfE, the first thing they'll come back with is to say, well, you already have a voice at this table. How are you using that to make a difference? So I think that's where I think it's critical that we show that the sector is using the tools that it already has, and where there are frustrations, it's because those tools simply are not effective.
I agree, and it would be very, very good to know where there. I mean, I suspect Neil may be a good repository here, but it'd be very good to know which areas where there is an exemplar of that best practice, David. I do not. It's certainly not in the county I represent.
I think just very quickly before we finish, Panima wanted to come in. Panima, did you want to?
Yes, just on schools forums, I think Councillor David Simmons is right to bring it up, because majority of the schools forums, unfortunately, are not really effective in terms of the PVI sector's engagement. They are a lone voice amongst many teachers, but some local authorities do it well, and we have some examples of that. But I think, the part of the review that we're talking about, the whole of the kind of, childcare system, that needs to happen at the local authority level as well, the schools forums, because I think the way decisions are made, if they are made in proper engagement with the sector, we wouldn't have seen this level of underspends. We've just done an FOI. We're currently analysing the results. So far, we've got about 70 local authorities who responded. Already, we're seeing millions of underspend still. This is for 2019-20. So I think, that's what we need to really fundamentally address in terms of exactly, even though the earliest element is ring fenced within the DSG, but it's actually not reaching providers. And that's a major issue.
Thank you.
So finally, we can go to Neil as well, who just wanted to come in. Neil, go ahead.
On mute there. Yes, sorry. I just felt the debate around economies and efficiencies is wholly inappropriate. We have been starved of funding for decades, and to try and sort of pin things back now is not the time. We would not be having this discussion if we were talking about children that are 5 years of age plus. We're not seen as educationalists, and that's the battle that we have. And until we get the recognition that we educate and we steer children, that we create good citizens, strong citizens, then frankly, I can't see that we will get that investment. But it's for politicians, I would suggest, to stop regarding this sector as babysitters and to realise the worth they have. Just about every, and I will stop, but just about everything that comes out of the Department for Education at the moment is schools, schools, schools. Every offer, whether it's testing, whether it is the catch-up fund, is schools, nothing for early years. So I'm not convinced that politicians, some clearly do, but many politicians really value our early years in this sector. And I thought it was interesting when the Duchess of Cambridge launched the Royal Foundation report, how absent the DfE were in making any comment. I did several radio interviews and a TV interview, and they all commented, where are the DfE in any of this? So I think the reality is we have to battle harder. I don't think we can accept that, it is a slow change and you have to dabble here and dabble there. You have to be loud. I'll stop.
All right, Neil. I think you know that the politicians involved in this group are not of the view that you are childminders. It is more than my life is worth if that was my view when I went home. You're right. It is how the sector is viewed far too often, which is why, if you notice, well, you were involved in helping with it, but everything I said in the debate was about early education and about this being early education and not just preschool nurseries. So listen, thank you everybody. Have a good Christmas break. As the expression goes, be jolly careful and keep safe. And we will see you next year for the continuation of our God's work. Thank you.